The howling wind drove needles of ice against the small wooden wagon as Jane Blackburn clutched her swollen belly, praying for the blizzard to subside. Wyoming Territory, 1868, what had once been a journey of hope toward South Pass City, had become a desperate fight for two lives in the merciless grip of winter. Jane had been traveling for weeks, her husband's death in a mining accident back in Missouri still raw in her heart. 6 months pregnant and alone, she had set out west with little more than her grief, a wagon of sparse belongings, and the dream of reaching her cousin in the gold rush town before her baby arrived. But nature had other plans. The team of horses had spooked when the storm descended without warning, bolting into the vast white emptiness before breaking free of their traces. Now Jane huddled beneath layers of blankets, the wagon listing dangerously to one side where a wheel had broken in the frantic rush. The provisions she had carefully rationed would last another day at most, and the temperature continued to plummet with each passing hour. "Hold on, little one," she whispered, rubbing her belly as another contraction seized her. "It's too soon for you to come. We need to find help first." 20 miles away, Virgil Townsend pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame as he surveyed the ranch he'd spent 5 years building. The cattle were secured in the barn, extra hay distributed to see them through what promised to be the worst storm of the season. His foreman and the 2 ranch hands had ridden into town the previous day for supplies, leaving him alone to weather the blizzard. Something about the gathering storm had unsettled him deeply. At 32, Virgil had survived enough Wyoming winters to recognize the deadly potential in those swirling clouds. He thought of the travelers he'd seen passing through last week, hoping they'd all found shelter. He was about to head inside when his stallion, Thunder, began pawing nervously in his stall, whinnying with unusual distress. Virgil had learned long ago to trust the instincts of his animals. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, approaching the agitated horse. "You sensing something I can't?" Thunder's ears were pricked forward, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where the storm seemed fiercest. Virgil hesitated only briefly before making his decision. He quickly packed provisions, ammunition, extra blankets, and medical supplies. If someone was stranded out there, they wouldn't survive the night without help. "You're either the smartest man in Wyoming Territory or the biggest fool," he muttered to himself as he saddled Thunder. "Let's hope it's the former." The storm hit him full force as he rode eastward, guided only by Thunder's uncanny sense of direction and his own knowledge of the terrain. The temperature had dropped so drastically that ice formed on his mustache and eyelashes within minutes. Visibility extended barely beyond Thunder's ears, but the stallion moved with surprising determination. 3 hours into the punishing journey, Virgil was beginning to doubt his decision. His fingers, despite the heavy gloves, had gone numb, and each breath was a painful stab in his lungs. He was about to turn back when Thunder suddenly changed direction, moving with renewed purpose. "What have you found, boy?" Virgil's voice was nearly lost in the howling wind. Squinting through the wall of white, he glimpsed what appeared to be tracks, faint impressions rapidly disappearing under fresh snow, but tracks nonetheless. Wagon wheels. Jane had abandoned the shelter of her wagon an hour earlier, after the creaking of wood and the shifting weight convinced her it was about to topple over entirely. The contractions were coming more frequently now, a terrifying development that spurred her into desperate action. Wrapping herself in every layer she could manage, she had set out blindly into the storm. "One foot after the other," she commanded herself, pushing forward with stubborn determination. "Think of the baby, just keep moving," but her strength was failing rapidly. Each step became a monumental effort as the snow reached past her knees. The cold had penetrated so deeply that she could no longer feel her feet, and the wind disoriented her so completely that she might have been walking in circles. The baby kicked vigorously, sensing her distress. When she stumbled for the 3rd time, Jane couldn't find the strength to rise again. Curling protectively around her swollen belly, she whispered apologies to her unborn child as consciousness began to slip away. The sound came faintly at first, so faintly that Jane believed it to be a hallucination, the rhythmic crunch of hooves compacting snow, a horse's worried whinny. Then suddenly, strong hands were touching her face, lifting her shoulders. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" The voice penetrated the fog enveloping her mind. Jane forced her eyes open to see a man's face, partially obscured by a snow-crusted scarf leaning close to hers. "The baby," she managed to whisper. "Please, help my baby." Virgil's heart pounded as he assessed the situation. A pregnant woman, alone in the wilderness during the worst blizzard in years, it defied all logic, yet here she was. He could see the terror in her eyes, but also a fierce will to survive. "I've got you," he assured her, quickly making his decision. "My ranch is closest. We need to get you warm." With gentle but urgent movements, he helped her onto Thunder, then mounted behind her, supporting her weight against his chest. He could feel her trembling violently, a good sign, actually, as it meant her body was still fighting the cold. The stillness of hypothermia hadn't claimed her yet. "I'm Jane," she murmured through chattering teeth. "Jane Blackburn, Virgil Townsend," he replied, urging Thunder forward. "You're safe now, Miss Blackburn. Just stay awake and talk to me. Tell me what brought you out here alone." As they battled through the storm, Jane struggled to keep her eyes open, forcing words through frozen lips. She told him about her husband Daniel's death in the mine collapse, about her cousin in South Pass City who didn't even know she was coming, about her desperate hope for a new beginning. Virgil listened, asking questions whenever her voice began to fade, keeping her conscious through the perilous journey. He couldn't help but admire her courage. A pregnant widow making such a journey alone spoke of either madness or extraordinary strength. Perhaps both. When the silhouette of his ranch house finally appeared through the swirling snow, Virgil felt a profound relief. "We made it, Jane," he said, but received no response. She had fallen unconscious against his chest. Moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to emergencies, Virgil carried Jane inside, laying her before the hearth where embers still glowed. He quickly built up the fire, then set about the delicate task of removing her wet outer garments while preserving her modesty. The severity of her condition became apparent as he worked. Her skin was dangerously pale, her lips tinged with blue. And her belly. Virgil had little experience with expectant mothers, but he could see that the baby was pressing low, as if preparing for arrival. "Not here, not now," he muttered, recalling what little he knew about childbirth from the few times ranch animals had birthed under his care. This was altogether different and far more frightening. He wrapped her in warm blankets, heated broth on the stove, and began the careful process of warming her extremities to prevent the damage that came from thawing too quickly. Throughout the night, he worked tirelessly, monitoring her breathing and temperature, forcing small sips of warm liquid between her lips whenever she showed signs of consciousness. Dawn broke with no lessening of the storm. Virgil, exhausted from his vigil, was dozing in a chair beside the bed where he'd moved Jane when a small, pained sound jolted him awake. Her eyes were open, confusion giving way to recognition as she took in her surroundings. "Mr. Townsend, Virgil," he corrected, moving quickly to her side. "How are you feeling?" Jane attempted to sit up, wincing with the effort. "The baby," she began, just as her face contorted with pain. Her hands clutched at her abdomen as she gasped, "It's coming. The baby's coming now." Panic flooded Virgil's chest, but he forced it down. "The storm's still raging. I can't fetch the doctor from town." "There's no time anyway," Jane said, her voice steadier than he would have expected. "I need clean cloths, hot water, and something to bite down on." When he hesitated, she fixed him with a determined stare. "This baby isn't waiting for better circumstances, Mr. Townsend. We'll have to manage." The next hours were a blur of activity as Virgil followed Jane's instructions, grateful that she seemed to know what needed to be done. He boiled water, gathered clean linens, and steeled himself for what was to come. When the time arrived, he found an inner reserve of calm he hadn't known he possessed. "Push when I tell you," he directed, positioning himself at the foot of the bed. The reality of what was happening, that he, a bachelor rancher who'd barely spoken to a woman in months, was now delivering a baby, seemed almost absurd. Jane's strength through her ordeal was remarkable. Despite exhaustion, despite the lingering effects of cold, despite being in the home of a stranger, she focused entirely on bringing her child safely into the world. Her determination humbled Virgil, who had never witnessed such raw courage. When the baby finally emerged, a tiny, red-faced boy with a surprisingly hearty cry, something shifted irrevocably in Virgil's heart. He cleaned the infant carefully before placing him in Jane's arms, watching as tears spilled down her cheeks. "He's perfect," she whispered, cradling her son. "Daniel would have been so proud. What will you name him?" Virgil asked softly. Jane studied the baby's face for a long moment. "Thomas, it was my father's name." Then she looked up at Virgil, her eyes reflecting a gratitude beyond words. "You saved us both. I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," he replied gruffly, suddenly self-conscious. "Any decent man would have done the same." "No," Jane said with quiet certainty. "Not any man would have ridden into that storm, not any man would have found me, and certainly not any man would have delivered my baby with such care." She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. "You're a good man, Virgil Townsend." The blizzard continued for 3 more days, during which Jane recovered her strength while Virgil cared for both mother and child with unexpected tenderness. He found himself drawn to the tiny boy, marveling at the perfect fingers and the way the infant seemed to watch him with solemn curiosity. "He likes you," Jane observed on the 3rd evening as Virgil carefully held Thomas. "Hard to tell what such a little fella is thinking," Virgil replied, but he couldn't hide his pleased expression. "I've been considering what to do when the weather clears," Jane said hesitantly. "My cousin in South Pass City, I've never actually met her. She was my mother's cousin's daughter, and we've only exchanged letters. I'm not even certain she'll welcome me." Virgil looked up sharply. "You mean you traveled all this way to someone who might not take you in?" Jane's cheeks colored slightly. "It sounds foolish when you put it that way. But after Daniel died, there was nothing left for me in Missouri. I had to go somewhere, and her letters seemed kind." Virgil was silent for a long moment, considering his next words carefully. "You could stay here," he finally said, "not permanently if you don't wish it. But at least until spring makes travel safer for you and the boy." "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition," he interrupted. "This place is too big for just one person anyway, and I could use the company." He didn't add that the thought of them leaving already created an emptiness in him he couldn't explain. The weather broke on the 4th day, revealing a landscape transformed by the blizzard. Drifts higher than a man's head surrounded the ranch house, and the sky was a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the deadly storm that had preceded it. Virgil set out on horseback to check on his cattle and to see if the road to town was passable. He needed to inform the doctor of Jane's condition and the birth, and to purchase supplies suitable for an infant. The journey gave him time to think, to examine the unexpected feelings stirring within him. In town, his appearance at the general store with requests for baby items caused quite a stir. Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, fixed him with a suspicious stare. "A baby, you say, at your ranch, and whose baby might that be, Virgil Townsend?" Virgil explained the situation as succinctly as possible, but he could already see the speculation in her eyes. By nightfall, half the town would be wondering about the mysterious woman and child at the Townsend ranch. Dr. Green was more pragmatic. "You did well from the sound of it," he said when Virgil described the birth. "But I should examine both mother and child as soon as possible. These first weeks are critical. The road to the ranch should be clear enough by tomorrow," Virgil replied. "I'd appreciate if you could come out then." When Virgil returned laden with supplies, he found Jane sitting in the rocking chair by the window, nursing Thomas. The sight stirred something protective and tender within him. "The doctor will come tomorrow," he announced, setting down his packages, "and I've brought a few things you might need." Jane's eyes widened as he unpacked baby clothing, soft blankets, and a small wooden cradle. "Virgil, this is too much nonsense," he said gruffly. "The boy needs proper things." That night, as they sat before the fire, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his new cradle, Virgil found himself telling Jane about his life. He spoke of coming west at 19, working cattle drives and saving every penny until he could buy his own land. He told her about building the ranch from nothing, about the loneliness that sometimes settled over him in the quiet evenings. "Why did you never marry?" Jane asked softly. Virgil stared into the flames. "Never seemed to be the right time or the right woman." He glanced at her. "What was he like?" "Your husband," a sad smile touched Jane's lips. "Daniel was kind, hardworking. He had dreams of something better than the mines." Her hand moved unconsciously to caress Thomas's head. "He would have been a good father." "I'm sorry you lost him," Virgil said sincerely. "So am I." Jane met his gaze. "But I'm grateful fate brought me here, even through such terrible circumstances." The doctor's visit the following day brought good news. Both Jane and Thomas were healthy despite their ordeal. Dr. Green praised Virgil's quick actions in the storm and his care afterward. "You've got a natural talent with that baby," he remarked as he prepared to leave. "Ever thought of having some of your own?" Virgil felt his face warm. Never had the opportunity to consider it seriously. The doctor glanced meaningfully toward the house where Jane was resting. "Well, opportunities have a way of presenting themselves when least expected." As winter settled into a rhythm of clear, cold days interspersed with lighter snowfalls, life at the Townsend Ranch developed its own rhythm as well. Jane recovered her strength fully and insisted on taking over the household duties, cooking meals that made Virgil realize how poorly he'd been feeding himself all these years. Thomas grew stronger each day, his curious eyes tracking movement, his tiny hands reaching for anything within grasp. Virgil found himself spending evenings holding the boy, telling him stories about cattle and horses and the wild beauty of Wyoming Territory. "You're good with him," Jane said one evening as Virgil walked the floor with a fussy Thomas, the baby's head resting against his shoulder. "He's easy to be good with," Virgil replied, though the praise pleased him more than he cared to admit. Jane watched them for a moment longer. "I've been thinking. When spring comes and the roads are clear, I should continue to South Pass City as I planned." The words hit Virgil with unexpected force. He'd known this arrangement was temporary, of course, but somewhere along the way, he'd begun to hope for something more permanent. "Is that what you want?" he asked carefully. Jane hesitated. "I need to make a life for Thomas and myself." "I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely." "It's not an imposition," Virgil said, more sharply than he'd intended. He softened his tone. "What I mean is, you and Thomas, you've brought something to this place that was missing before." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of feelings neither was quite ready to name. The arrival of Virgil's ranch hands returning from their extended stay in town broke the moment. Ben, Miguel, and Hank burst in with boisterous greetings that turned to stunned silence when they saw Jane and the baby. "Boss," Ben, the foreman, looked from Virgil to Jane with undisguised confusion. "Didn't know you had company." Virgil quickly explained the situation, introducing Jane as a widow he'd rescued from the blizzard. The men were polite but clearly curious, especially when they saw how naturally Virgil handled the infant. That night, after Jane had retired to the bedroom that had become hers, Ben approached Virgil as he sat alone by the fire. "She seems like a fine woman," the foreman said casually. "She is," Virgil agreed, waiting for whatever was really on Ben's mind, planning to stay long. Virgil stared into his coffee cup. "She talks about moving on to South Pass City in spring." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you feel about that?" "What do you mean? Come on, boss. I've worked for you 5 years. Never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her and that baby." Virgil was silent for a long moment. "It's not that simple, Ben. She's still grieving her husband. She came west with a plan and it wasn't to end up here." "Plans change," Ben said simply. "Just don't wait too long to let her know you'd like her to stay." As January gave way to February, Virgil found excuses to delay Jane's departure. The roads weren't safe yet. Thomas was still too young for such a journey. Her cousin might not be prepared for their arrival. Each reason sounded hollow to his own ears, yet Jane accepted them without protest. One crisp afternoon, as Jane hung laundry in the bitter cold while Thomas slept inside, she noticed Virgil working with a spirited young mare in the corral. She paused to watch his gentle firmness with the animal, the quiet confidence in his movements. In the months since he'd found her in the snow, Jane had come to see many sides of this solitary rancher. His kindness extended beyond the dramatic rescue to daily considerations, the way he'd built shelves in her room for her few possessions, how he carved small wooden toys for Thomas, his patience when teaching her about ranch life. She was falling in love with him. The realization didn't shock her as much as the accompanying guilt. Daniel had been dead less than a year. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man so soon? That evening, as they sat before the fire, Thomas asleep in his cradle, Virgil broke their comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "Do you think you could be happy here, not just for now, but permanently?" Jane's heart quickened. "What exactly are you asking, Virgil?" He turned to face her fully, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I'm asking if you might consider making this your home, yours and Thomas's." "As your housekeeper?" she asked softly, needing clarity. "No," Virgil ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling for words. "As my wife, if you'd have me." Jane's breath caught. "Virgil, I know it's soon," he rushed on. "I know you're still healing from your loss, but these months with you and Thomas have shown me what I've been missing all these years. I never thought I'd want a family, but now I can't imagine this place without you both in it." Tears welled in Jane's eyes. "I feel something for you too, Virgil, something I wasn't expecting, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of replacing Daniel too quickly. Of making a decision based on gratitude or convenience rather than love." She looked down at her hands. "And I'm afraid of what might happen if I let myself depend on someone again, only to lose them." Virgil reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "I can't promise nothing will ever happen to me. Life on the frontier doesn't offer those guarantees, but I can promise to care for you and Thomas with everything I have for as long as I'm able." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "As for the rest, I don't expect you to forget Daniel. He'll always be Thomas's father, but I believe there's room in a heart to honor what was lost while still embracing what might be." Jane looked into his eyes, seeing the steadfast honesty there. "Could I have some time to be certain?" "Of course," he replied, though she could see it cost him to hide his disappointment. "Take all the time you need." March brought the first real signs of spring, patches of grass appearing through melting snow, birds returning from their winter absence, longer days filled with warming sunlight. Thomas was growing faster than Jane could believe, his personality emerging in gummy smiles and determined attempts to roll over. One morning, Jane found Virgil at his desk, writing a letter. "To whom are you writing?" she asked, curious about his uncharacteristic correspondence. "Your cousin in South Pass City," he replied without looking up. "I thought it right to let her know you're safe, in case she was expecting you before now." The gesture touched Jane deeply, his thoughtfulness extending even to people he'd never met. It was one of countless small kindnesses that had gradually convinced her of the depth of his character. "Thank you," she said simply. He glanced up then, a question in his eyes that he didn't voice. That afternoon, as Thomas napped, Jane walked alone to the small rise behind the ranch house. The land stretched before her, greening under the spring sun, rolling hills dotted with cattle, the distant mountains still snow-capped against the blue sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperate flight from grief, the terrifying storm, the miracle of Thomas's birth in this unexpected place. And she thought about Virgil, his quiet strength, his tenderness with Thomas, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. She'd come to know him through 100 daily interactions, the way he treated his ranch hands with respect, how he sang softly, off-key, when he thought no one could hear, his habit of reading by lamplight late into the night. She realized she no longer thought of the ranch as a temporary shelter, but as home. When she returned to the house, she found Virgil on the porch, mending a bridle with practiced hands. He looked up as she approached, his expression cautiously hopeful. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Jane said without preamble. Virgil set aside his work, giving her his full attention. And when you found me in that storm, I was running from the past with only the vaguest notion of what might lie ahead. She sat beside him on the porch step. I never expected to find a future here with you, and have you, he asked quietly, found a future here? Jane met his gaze steadily. I believe I have. If your offer still stands, I would be honored to become your wife, Virgil Townsend. The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but he pulled her gently into his arms, his voice rough with emotion. Nothing would make me happier. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Dr. Green and Ben serving as witnesses. Jane wore a simple blue dress that Virgil had ridden 3 hours to purchase from the nearest dressmaker. And Thomas, dressed in a white gown Jane had sewn, watched the proceedings with solemn interest from Ben's arms. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, both of them aware of the unlikely path that had brought them to this moment. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Virgil's kiss was tender yet full of promise. The reception at the ranch afterward was a jovial affair, with neighbors from miles around coming to celebrate. Many had heard the dramatic story of the rescue during the blizzard, and more than one guest remarked that it seemed like fate. God's hand, more like, Mrs. Patterson declared. What else would send Virgil out in that terrible storm at exactly the right moment? As the celebration continued around them, Virgil drew Jane aside for a moment of privacy. I have something for you, he said, producing a small velvet pouch. It belonged to my mother. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Jane opened it to find it empty, waiting for mementos of their choosing. It's beautiful, she whispered as he fastened it around her neck. Not half as beautiful as you, he replied, his hands lingering on her shoulders. I never thought I'd find someone like you, Jane, someone who makes this place feel truly like a home. That night, after the guests had departed and Thomas was asleep in his cradle, husband and wife shared their first private moments together. Their coming together was gentle, considerate, both learning each other with tender exploration. Jane found in Virgil's arms a passion she hadn't expected, and he discovered in her a responsiveness that left him breathless. Afterward, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Jane felt the last vestiges of her grief giving way to something new, not erasing the past, but allowing it to settle into its proper place as she embraced her future. I love you, she whispered against his chest. It was the first time she'd said the words aloud, though they'd been growing in her heart for months. Virgil's arms tightened around her. And I love you, Jane Townsend, you and Thomas both. Spring flowed into summer, bringing new rhythms to ranch life. Jane planted a vegetable garden that thrived under her care, put up preserves for the coming winter, and became adept at managing the household accounts. Thomas grew stronger each day, crawling enthusiastically around the house and yard, his dark eyes following Virgil's every move with undisguised adoration. For his part, Virgil found a joy in family life he'd never anticipated. He built a sturdy fence around the yard so Thomas could play safely outdoors, constructed a rocking horse that became the boy's favorite possession, and spent evenings teaching Jane to ride, her initial nervousness giving way to genuine enjoyment. In July, a letter arrived from Jane's cousin in South Pass City, expressing delight at the news of Jane's marriage and inviting the new family to visit when convenient. Jane found herself curiously detached from the prospect, realizing how completely she had embraced her new life. We should go, Virgil suggested when she showed him the letter. When the summer work slows down, it would be good for you to meet your family. The trip to South Pass City in August revealed a bustling gold mining town, rough around the edges but growing rapidly. Cousin Alina proved to be a friendly, talkative woman who welcomed them warmly, marveling at Thomas's growth and Jane's obvious happiness. When your letter came saying you were headed west, I worried myself sick about you traveling alone in your condition, Alina confessed. Then when you didn't arrive, I feared the worst. To think you were caught in that terrible blizzard and saved by the man who would become your husband, it's like something from a novel. Jane smiled, her hand finding Virgil's. Sometimes the best stories are the ones we live rather than read. They stayed 3 days, during which Virgil conducted business with local merchants while Jane reconnected with the cousin she'd never met. On their final evening, as they prepared for the journey home, Eleanor pulled Jane aside. "I'm glad you found him," she said simply. "Or rather, that he found you. He looks at you like you're the sunrise after a long night." The return journey to the ranch filled Jane with a sense of rightness. The land that had once seemed so foreign to her Missouri-raised eyes now appeared welcoming, familiar. And when the ranch house came into view, she felt the undeniable tug of home. That autumn brought news that filled both Jane and Virgil with quiet joy. Another child was on the way, due in the late spring. Thomas, now walking with increasing confidence, seemed to sense the significance of the announcement, patting Jane's still flat stomach with gentle curiosity. "Brother or sister?" he asked in his limited vocabulary. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Jane explained, smiling at his serious expression. Virgil's reaction to the news was one of stunned happiness. "A child of our own," he murmured, his hand joining Thomas's on Jane's abdomen, "though Thomas already feels like mine in every way that matters." "He is yours," Jane assured him, "in all the important ways." Winter came again, but this time there was no fear in its approach. The ranch was well prepared, the house warm and secure, the family bound together in the cozy evenings by the fire. On the anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Virgil presented Jane with a gift, a small painting he'd commissioned from an artist passing through town, depicting the ranch in summer bloom. "For the days when winter seems endless," he explained. A reminder that spring always returns. Jane's eyes filled with tears as she accepted it. "1 year ago today, I thought Thomas and I would die in that storm. I had lost all hope." She looked around the home they had built together. "I never imagined I could find such happiness again." Virgil gathered her in his arms. "When thunder led me to your tracks that day, I was following more than just impressions in the snow. Something was pulling me toward you, though I didn't understand it then." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Some might call it instinct or luck. But I believe it was my heart leading me to where it belonged all along." The following May, as wildflowers carpeted the Wyoming hills, Jane gave birth to their daughter, Emma Grace Townsend, a robust baby with her father's determined chin and her mother's gentle eyes. Thomas, now 2 years old and fiercely proud of his role as big brother, appointed himself the baby's special guardian. Standing on the porch one evening, Emma sleeping against his shoulder while Jane and Thomas examined a frog they'd discovered near the garden, Virgil reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate ride into the blizzard that had seemed like madness at the time now revealed itself as the most important decision of his life. Jane looked up, catching his gaze, and the love that passed between them needed no words. They had found each other against impossible odds, creating a family and a future neither could have imagined. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant gold and crimson, Virgil knew with absolute certainty that some tracks were meant to be followed, no matter how faint, no matter how fierce the storm. For they might just lead to home. 5 years later, the Townsend Ranch had prospered beyond Virgil's most optimistic hopes. The original house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, which now included 3 children: Thomas, 7, and showing a natural affinity for horses; Emma, 5 and fiercely independent; and James, 3 and possessing his mother's gentle temperament. Jane had established herself as not merely a rancher's wife, but a respected member of the community, teaching at the small school that had been built 2 miles from their property, and serving on the committee that had finally brought a proper doctor to settle permanently in the area. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, Virgil and Jane would ride to the small rise behind the house, the same spot where Jane had made her decision to stay all those years ago. There they would watch the sunset together, reminiscing about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together and the life they had built since. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if thunder hadn't sensed something that day? Jane asked during one such evening, her head resting against Virgil's shoulder. "I try not to think about it," he admitted, his arm tightening around her. "But I believe we were meant to find each other one way or another." Jane smiled, watching their children playing in the yard below, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "I think you're right. Some things are simply meant to be." And as they made their way back to the house that had become the heart of their world, Jane reflected that life's harshest storms sometimes lead to the most unexpected blessings, if only one has the courage to follow the tracks that fate lays before them.